The Anglo-Saxon Housecarls, c. 900 to 1066 AD. What do you get when Viking muscle meets royal loyalty? The Housecarls, axe-swinging bodyguards who could split a night and still make it home for supper. But how did these elite warriors rise from Norse chaos to defend England's last Anglo-Saxon king? Why did their shield wall become the final stand against the Norman tide? And what really happened on that blood-soaked hill in 1066? Stick around. This isn't just history. It's a battlefield thriller with beards, betrayal, and a whole lot of broken bones. Our story begins in the late 9th century, when the Vikings were less gentle Norsemen and more axe-wielding thunderstorms in human form. They didn't knock politely. They arrived on longships, set your village on fire, and left with your livestock, your silver, and occasionally your grandmother. These Norse raiders were so persistent that even the mighty Carolingian kings of Francia had to throw up their hands and say, "Fine, you want land? Take it. Just stop burning our churches." Thus, in 911, King Charles the Simple, a name that screams, "I lost every argument at court," handed over a chunk of northern France to Rollo the Viking. Rollo, who had the charm of a berserker and the negotiation skills of a used longship salesman, accepted the deal and founded the Duchy of Normandy. Now, while Rollo was busy turning Vikings into Normans, teaching them to wear pants, speak French, and build castles, the Anglo-Saxons across the Channel were dealing with their own Viking headaches. Enter the Housecarls. These weren't your average foot soldiers. Oh no, the Housecarls were the medieval equivalent of special ops, elite bodyguards, professional warriors, and part-time tax enforcers with a flair for intimidation. They were modeled after the Norse Housecarlar, meaning housemen, and were introduced to England by King Cnut the Great, a Viking who somehow became King of England, Denmark, and Norway. Basically, the medieval version of winning 3 lotteries in a row. Cnut needed loyal, battle-hardened warriors to keep his patchwork empire from unraveling. So he created the Housecarls, men who were paid in coin, land, and the occasional right to swing a Dane axe at anyone who looked at the king funny. They were armored in mail, carried round shields, and wielded axes so large they could split a man and his horse in half, vertically. Fast forward to the 11th century. England was ruled by Edward the Confessor, a king so pious he probably apologized to his food before eating it. Edward had no heir, which in medieval politics is like walking into a lion's den wearing bacon pants. To secure his throne, Edward married Edith, daughter of Earl Godwin of Wessex, the most powerful man in England not wearing a crown. But Godwin wasn't thrilled about Edward's Norman entourage, who were flooding the court with fancy accents and suspiciously good wine. Tensions rose like a poorly baked meat pie. Eventually, Edward exiled Godwin and his family in 1051, flexing his royal muscles with the help of the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. But Edward, ever the schemer, also named his cousin Duke William of Normandy as his heir, just in case things got spicy. Spoiler, they did. Godwin returned with an army, rallied the navy, the burghers, and even the peasants, who probably just wanted their pigs back, forcing Edward to restore his earldom. Godwin didn't openly oppose William's claim, but you could practically hear him muttering, "Over my dead body." Meanwhile, in Normandy, young William, illegitimate son of Duke Robert, was handed the duchy at age 8. That's right, a child with no legitimate claim, no allies, and a kingdom full of power-hungry nobles. It was like giving a toddler the keys to a Ferrari and hoping he doesn't crash into the papacy. William survived assassination attempts, rebellions, and enough political intrigue to fill a dozen soap operas. By his 30s, he had turned into a master tactician and a ruthless leader, controlling most of northern France and earning the nickname William the Bastard, which, in medieval terms, was practically a compliment. Back in England, Godwin died suddenly, probably from choking on his own ambition, and his son Harold took over as Earl of Wessex. With his brothers controlling other earldoms, the Godwins basically ran England like a family business. King Edward, now old and increasingly frail, withdrew from politics and leaned heavily on the Godwins. When he died in January 1066, the throne was up for grabs like a golden goose at a Viking auction. According to some witnesses, Edward briefly woke from his coma, pointed at someone, and died. The Godwin-controlled court interpreted this as, "Harold's the guy." and crowned him king the very next day. Subtle? Not even remotely. Effective? Absolutely. When William heard the news, he was livid. He claimed Edward had promised him the throne and began assembling an invasion force so large it made the Channel look like rush-hour traffic. Nobles from Normandy, Flanders, Brittany, and France joined in, lured by promises of land, titles, and the chance to loot England like it was a Viking buffet. But Harold wasn't just facing William. There was Edgar Atheling, the teenage heir of Edward the Exile, who had a claim but no army. And then there was Tostig, Harold's own brother, who had been booted from Northumbria for overtaxing the locals like a medieval IRS agent on steroids. Tostig, ever the drama queen, teamed up with Harold Hardrada of Norway, a Viking king with a claim to the English throne through a convoluted agreement involving Magnus and Harthacnut. Basically, everyone and their cousin thought they deserved the crown. William was ready to sail, but the winds weren't cooperating, so he waited, while Harold kept his army on high alert along the coast. But as summer dragged on, supplies ran low, and the harvest season beckoned. Harold disbanded much of his army in early September, thinking he could regroup later. Bad timing. Just as Harold returned to London, he got word that Tostig and Hardrada had invaded Northumbria and crushed Earl Morcar's forces. With 10,000 Vikings stomping through the north, Harold had no choice but to act. And act he did. In a feat of logistical wizardry and sheer determination, Harold marched his army from London to York in under 4 days. That's right, 4 days. No horses, no highways, just grit, boots, and the occasional motivational speech involving ale and vengeance. Godwinson pulled off what can only be described as a medieval miracle. Facing the fearsome Viking king Harold Hardrada and his traitorous brother Tostig, Harold's army, still sore from marching 185 miles in 4 days, crushed the Norse invasion like a stale biscuit under a war boot. Hardrada, who had come expecting a crown, got a burial instead. Tostig, who'd hoped for revenge, got a one-way ticket to Valhalla. The Anglo-Saxon Housecarls, those elite warriors with arms like tree trunks and axes that could split a knight from his horse, fought like men possessed. It was a glorious day. But just as Harold was about to raise a victory toast, a messenger arrived, probably panting like a winded squirrel, with news that made the king's stomach drop. The Normans have landed. Cue the record scratch. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy had finally caught a favorable wind and sailed into Sussex like a man arriving fashionably late to a royal brawl. He wasn't just here to fight, he was here to win. And he knew that logistics were the real battlefield. First, he captured Pevensey, then Hastings. Both towns were fortified, giving him a cozy base of operations and a pantry to raid. A few of his ships, blown off course, landed at Romney, where the Normans fought the local fyrd, peasants with pitchforks and a lot of enthusiasm but not much armor. William, ever the strategist, took his time. He knew Harold was up north, nursing bruises and burying Vikings. The longer he waited, the more rested his troops became, and the more Harold's army resembled a medieval zombie march. Harold, fresh off his victory and still smelling of Viking blood, turned his army around and began another forced march, this time south. By early October, he reached London. His men were exhausted, their feet probably mutinous, and their armor still sticky from Stamford Bridge. They camped near the capital for a week, catching up on sleep, sharpening weapons, and probably wondering why their king had a habit of chasing battles like a moth to flame. Harold could have waited, assembled a larger force, maybe even sent a sternly worded letter to William. But no, he was riding high on victory and wanted to strike fast. Unfortunately, Norman scouts spotted his movement. So much for surprise. Harold chose his battlefield wisely. Senlac Hill, a south-sloping plateau with dense woods and swampy terrain guarding the flanks and rear. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, "Come at me, bro," but with strategic finesse. His army was almost entirely infantry. In the center stood the Housecarls, battle-hardened professionals, though their numbers were thinned from the Viking clash. These were men who could cleave a knight in half and still have enough energy to insult his horse. Flanking them were the fyrd, local militia, peasants with spears, axes, and a lot of heart. They were motivated, yes, but trained? Not so much. Think of them as enthusiastic extras in a very violent play. William's army was a well-oiled machine. In the center, Norman knights, archers, and infantry. On the flanks, Franco-Flemish and Brittonic cavalry and foot soldiers. These weren't amateurs. They were seasoned warriors, organized, disciplined, and itching for glory. At dawn, William sent his archers forward, hoping to soften the Anglo-Saxon line. But Harold's men were packed tighter than a tavern on payday, their shield wall absorbing arrows like a sponge absorbs regret. The volleys hit at flat angles, bouncing off shields and egos alike. Next came the infantry, trudging uphill to test the wall. They met a wall of wood, iron, and sheer stubbornness. No gaps, no breakthroughs, just bruises and broken dreams. Then came the cavalry. William led his knights up the slope, hoping their charge would shatter the line. But the shield wall held firm. Horses were cut down by housecarls wielding axes like divine judgment. The Normans fell back to regroup. On the left flank, the Bretons mistook the retreat for a rout and fled. Some Anglo-Saxons broke formation to chase them, because who doesn't love a good pursuit? William, seeing the chaos, ordered a general withdrawal. Then came the rumor: the Duke is dead. 2 of William's horses had been slain, and in the fog of war, whispers spread like wildfire. To squash the panic, William did what any dramatic leader would do. He removed his helmet, rode through the ranks, and shouted, "I'm alive!" It was the medieval version of a mic drop. William rallied his troops and sent knights to flank the pursuing Fyrd. The Anglo-Saxons, now isolated on a hillock, were surrounded and annihilated. Sensing opportunity, William launched another general assault. Again, arrows flew. Again, they bounced off shields. Again, infantry and cavalry charged, only to be met with spears, axes, and stones. The shield wall held. The Normans retreated. Both sides paused. Men collapsed, munched on hard bread, and probably cursed their kings. Losses were mounting for William. Harold's plan seemed to be working. Realizing brute force wasn't cutting it, William revised his strategy. He sent knights to charge and retreat, hoping to bait the Anglo-Saxons into chasing. It had worked earlier. Why not again? But Harold's men had learned. They stayed put. The shield wall remained intact. The feigned retreat failed. However, the skirmishes had taken their toll. The Housecarls, those ironclad warriors, were thinning. Their places were filled by Fyrd units, brave but less skilled. And so, the wall began to wobble. As the sun climbed higher over Senlac Hill, the Normans regrouped for yet another assault. This time, they came with conviction, and archers. The knights thundered forward, hooves pounding like war drums, while arrows rained down in support. It was less a battle and more a medieval mosh pit. For hours, steel clashed, shields splintered, and curses flew in Old English and Norman French. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall, though battered, held firm. But then, crack, the Norman line broke. Knights retreated in disarray, and the Anglo-Saxon defenders, perhaps tasting victory, did what every tired soldier dreams of. They chased. Now, whether Harold ordered the pursuit, or whether his men simply got carried away with adrenaline and poor impulse control, history isn't sure. But one thing is clear: this time, the feigned retreat worked like a charm. William's knights, pretending to flee like frightened chickens, suddenly wheeled around mid-panic and charged the pursuing Anglo-Saxons. The defenders, now scattered and panting from their downhill sprint, were caught in the open. No shield wall, no formation, just a lot of regret and very angry horses. The Norman cavalry carved through them like butter on a hot day. Axes and spears were no match for the speed and momentum of mounted knights. The Anglo-Saxon line began to unravel. With part of the shield wall dismantled, William seized the moment. His infantry and cavalry surged up the hill, bearing down on Harold's remaining forces like a tidal wave of iron and ambition. The Anglo-Saxons, now outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of breath, began to crumble. The Fyrd, brave but poorly trained, broke ranks. The Housecarls, those elite warriors who had fought valiantly all day, were now surrounded, their numbers thinned, their axes dulled. And then came the moment that would echo through history. Legend has it that Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, was struck in the eye by an arrow. Some say it was Norman. Others whisper it was friendly fire, perhaps the medieval equivalent of "oops." Toppled from his horse, Harold was then reportedly hacked to pieces by several Norman knights. It was a brutal, bloody end to a king who had marched, fought, and ruled with relentless vigor. His death shattered the morale of the Anglo-Saxon army. With their leader gone, the men fled the field, chased down by Norman soldiers eager to finish what they started. And so, on October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings ended in a decisive Norman victory. The Anglo-Saxons lost their king, their shield wall, and their grip on the throne. In the days that followed, William marched to London, putting down resistance and accepting submission. On Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, because nothing says happy holidays like a hostile takeover. With William's coronation, Anglo-Saxon rule came to an end. French became the language of the court, blending with Old English to form the glorious linguistic soup we now call modern English, where beef is Norman and cow is Saxon, and spelling makes no sense. William proved to be a formidable ruler. He built castles like a man with a Lego obsession, Tower of London, Windsor, and dozens more. He consolidated power, crushed rebellions, and laid the foundation for the Plantagenet dynasty. The Housecarls were gone. The shield wall was broken, but the legacy of Harold, William, and the Battle of Hastings would live on, in tapestries, textbooks, and the very DNA of the English language. If tales of shield walls, Viking vengeance, and Norman ambition stirred your soul, then don't just read history, live it. Subscribe now to unlock more legendary deep dives, gripping narratives, and exclusive content that brings the past roaring to life. Whether you're a scholar, a storyteller, or just someone who loves a good battle cry, this is your front row seat to the drama that shaped our world. Don't miss the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button and become part of the story, because legends aren't just told, they're followed.